so easy and simple to be happy. Or it should be easy and simple. But I marvel at the way we human beings can tangle it all up. So I've produced 3 videos that outline 3 powerful methods to regain our happiness, our contentedness, our joy, our peace. The first that continues on this video is called Reframing. Discovering our ego's illusions that make all this suffering possible. The second is the mental exercise, priming our happiness pump. And the third is balancing our brain chemistry. I hope you enjoy them.
Almost entirely, people are passive about emotions. They do little to manage them or cultivate the ones they desire. Emotions happen to us involuntarily, it seems. We passively identify with them to the extent that we will say, I am that emotion. I am happy. I am sad. I am stressed. I am overwhelmed. This video, part 1 of 3, is for those people who would like to take a more active role, consciously creating positive mental states while becoming more aware and in control of the negative ones. It's a challenge because we in the West have been changed by our industrial, commercialized, competitive values. We have been separated from our natural environment, a true sense of community, and from nature itself. Within the artificial construct, we find ourselves getting lost in ideas. People forever searching outside themselves for stimulation, entertainment, escape. In such a distracting, abnormal surrounding, out of sorts, ill at ease, the mind begins to identify with negative emotions and create a set of suffer stories to justify them. We create internal scripts and act the stories out, just like in a play. These stories are false identities that our egos accept, and they are the root cause of so much of our stress, anxiety, and depression, our suffering. Everyone around you, they all have a set of suffer stories. So do you. Suffer stories are as common as shame, and equally, we tend to avoid talking about them, let alone acknowledging them, accepting them, or confronting them. It can be uncomfortable to dredge them up, but it's worth it. Go ahead, get uncomfortable on purpose. Are you aware of any of your own suffer stories? If not, are you open to accepting that you have unconscious thoughts? Or do you believe that you are always aware of what moves you to think, speak, and act? If you are willing to be real enough with yourself to look inside earnestly, there is an effective way to heal our suffer stories called reframing. There's a worksheet designed to identify egoic suffer stories on our webpage, www.maitreyahealingcenter.com, which is linked below. On the home page, go to the More tab, then find Stress Questionnaire. We are not pretending at all that you're going to resolve this whole thing all at once right now. This is a process, and you can begin it with the use of the worksheet. Let's start with feelings. When you have negative emotions like betrayal, offense, anger, hurt, disgust, they are an important sign of a suffer story. It's useful and interesting to begin the process by identifying and confronting negative emotions head-on. Most of us are not used to this. Instead, we usually interpret, analyze, and blame. We say, I feel disrespected. I feel like this is a bad relationship. I feel like you are wrong. These are not feelings. Disrespected is your interpretation of someone's intention. A bad relationship is your analysis. Labeling as wrong is a kind of blaming. It's a good idea to review the list of negative feelings when needs are not being met on the questionnaire page, because it's difficult to describe emotions accurately when there's so many of them inside of us, because we're involved in feeling them, and also because we're used to interpreting, analyzing, and blaming. So which feelings do you sometimes identify with? Generally, during an emotional event, or right now, or you could say, today. Once you have found all the feeling words that sometimes happen for you, write them down so you can single them out and practice a kind of emotional aikido on each one. Several emotions at a time isn't a fair fight, but you have a good chance of defeating them one at a time. Start the practice by conjuring up the emotion inside of you, if you can. Feel it courageously. Face it. Acknowledge it without apology or self-judgment. If it rails against you, calmly step aside. Allow it to stumble, fall, or fatigue of its own accord. Engage it as long as it lasts. Soon it will dissipate of its own accord, defeated by the emotional aikido master. Search earnestly within yourself and review the list from time to time, because digging deep and discovering those hidden feelings can also be used as clues in the most important internal mystery that you may ever solve, identifying your own personal set of suffer stories. To help you get to your suffer stories, continue with the stress questionnaire, where there are questions like this. How do I sometimes think that I'm a bad person? Do I sometimes think I'm fundamentally flawed or damaged goods? How do I sometimes feel inadequate? Notice the emphasis on sometimes. We don't always act out the story, just sometimes. If we become aware enough, we can see the story occasionally pop up in our speech or internal scripts, sometimes obviously, but mostly in subtle ways, because we're busy, fully occupied with the logistics of life, work, relationships, doing things. But the suffer stories are there, underneath, and they affect our state of mind constantly, with a perpetual undercurrent of anxiety. So be patient about this discovering, and take time to reflect on the questionnaire. Allow time to fully discover the breadth and depth of your suffer stories, months or years. The prideful ego can be stubborn and clever, denying and disguising. Let your real self observe, watch, witness. Make it a daily practice and journal about it. Signs of a suffer story can sound like, I can't do something or other. I won't succeed at anything important. But you might not actually say those words. You might think it or feel it. Sometimes. It may show up in what you do not do from fear of failure or rejection. One way or another, you may express the idea, I am overwhelmed. I can't get it all done. I feel burdened. I feel like a failure. Follow these expressions to their source, and you will have discovered an inadequacy suffer story that identifies with the feeling that you're bad, and it makes you feel bad. Everyone has inadequacy suffer stories somewhere inside, even the most confident-looking of us. If you have ever felt jealous, offended, or ever thought in some way that you were just not worthy of love, or incapable of love, or right for love, then you are expressing an inadequacy suffer story. You may sometimes see or hear yourself in a victim role. It happens. Have you ever felt oppressed? Got the short end of the stick? Had unfortunate circumstances? Have you ever used the words, so-and-so made me feel, or so-and-so did this to me? Then, in that moment, you played the victim. And most everyone plays the victim role. But no one ever says, I am a victim. Instead, usually, the ego stays busy making other people out to be wrong and bad. That's the ego's little trick. The questionnaire can reveal insights into your inner workings. Take a look at the suffer story examples. See if any jump out at you. Once you have identified a suffer story, no matter how subtle the ego wants you to believe it is, endeavor to reframe it. Begin to free yourself. First, shine a light on the suffer story. Have a dialogue with yourself about it. Use as much reason as you can gather. Ask yourself if this story is true. Of course it isn't. That isn't you. That story does not, cannot define you. Think about it. The inadequacy suffer story, for example. Telling yourself, I'm not good enough. Good enough for who? And according to what standards? Essentially, if you think about it, that story mandates that you should be absolutely perfect at everything all the time. Perfection isn't even real. It's an imaginary concept. And inadequate compared to who? Inadequacy requires comparison. It is relative to others. But even the best in the world at any given task, like tennis, they fail. Someone better eventually comes along and bests them. Then they would be inadequate. Everyone would actually prove to be inadequate, eventually, which is what the ego wants. The ego revels in labeling and blaming, but it cannot stand against the light of reason. So instead of an inadequacy suffer story, you can choose to believe something different instead. Perhaps that you are a potent, capable human being who can create a wonderful life for yourself and others. You can choose to reframe all of your suffer stories. Make it a project. Even if you think it won't make much difference, it will. Reframe a story of being a bad person into someone who had not yet learned to appreciate and love yourself. Tease out all the details with dialogue. Bad according to what rules? Where did those rules come from? Instead of feeling overwhelmed because you can't get it all done, reframe that story. The unspoken belief that everything should always be perfect and organized and completed. Reframe that one because it's impossible. Instead, realize that it's a good sign, suggesting a life filled with purpose, that there is much that could be done. Focus on the basic facts, that you have a certain amount of time and energy to devote to getting things done, and you can spend it being contented and appreciative of your efforts. It is much more alive and joyful to think and believe this way. Reframe any blaming stories about others, which really just reveals what you resent about yourself. Have you declared someone else wrong or bad, inadequate or inferior? Or was your ego really just wanting to make itself feel right, good or superior? You have to realize the ego is constantly vacillating between feeling inadequate and superior. While reframing from the questionnaire and worksheet, if the logical, reasonable approach doesn't click for you, choose a different process. Once the story is recognized, just make a replacement story up, spontaneously, irrationally, if you will, just as irrational as the ego suffer stories. You can just as easily believe a new and wonderful story about yourself as you can the one that has you suffering. Sometimes it's just a matter of believing, and believing is free. How do you start believing something new? In our video, Adjusting the Mind, we address reprogramming the subconscious mind through the technology of affirmation. It works. But you've already started a new life by identifying the false within you, by shining a light on the shadows. And you have already started to become more conscious when the negative feeling happens, and it reminds you of an old story. Then you remind yourself of who you really are, either with a reasonable dialogue or a new affirmation. You have begun to take responsibility for your life in a mindful and interesting way.